Anything that you can conceivably name, single out, make a distinction of, regardless of whether it's physical and tangible or purely mental and conceptual, is an object or a form. And every object or form is really just a function. We can truly say that a thing is its function or that a thing is its purpose. In other words, a thing and its function or a thing and its purpose are identical. Things only have an identity so long as they have a function. If a thing doesn't carry out its function, then it becomes garbage, waste, to be assimilated back into the earth, to raw matter. A function is in flux. It's a motion, an action. We talk about functions as if they're things in and of themselves, but really they're just actions. We can readily see this in the man-made world. Every single thing that man creates is created to do something, to fulfill a purpose, a wheel, a road, a hammer, a door, and so on. We unthinkingly call it an object, but really it only has an identity to the extent that it does something. Even art, which is static and doesn't move, is created to do something, to evoke a feeling in us, because nothing is created unless it has a purpose. This is the concept of telos from the Greeks that's often cited in Christianity. We can see this in many of our names even. Baker, Smith, Carter, Fisher, Farmer, Carpenter, Miller, and that's just the Anglo names. My own name, Jason, means healer in Greek, and your name probably has some meaning as well. Traditionally, many names were given based on what that family did, like their vocation, or based on a hope or expectation of what that child would grow up to become. Like brave or wise, or for women, beautiful, gentle, caring, or else they were given the names of flowers or colors, all of which are also functions in and of themselves. The same exact concept applies to the natural world. We've drawn this imaginary line between the man-made and natural worlds, ignoring the fact that technology is just imitating nature. We think a car or a cell phone or an air conditioner has a function, but a tiger or a rose doesn't. We buy into this silly idea that all plants and animals exist simply to survive and reproduce, and also that non-living things exist for no specific reason at all. Really though, every single thing that we can positively identify in nature also has a function, even if we don't fully understand it. We can absolutely say that a tiger exists or was created to tiger, and that a rose exists to rose. And that applies on every level, from the highest and most general, that all animals were created to animal, plants were created to plant, down to the most specific. The individual animal or plant also exists to be what it is and to do what it's intended to do. These are the concepts of Dharma and Svadharma in Hinduism. There exists a higher natural order, Dharma, and also a particular individual suborder that applies to every individual thing. That's called Svadharma. This also applies even to so-called non-living things. A rock exists to rock. A sea exists to sea. A mountain to mountain. The same with the sun and the moon and so on. And the ancients understood this. In fact, it's what the original legitimate paganisms were based upon, because before they devolved into idolatry due to those people losing sight of the meaning of their symbols and reducing them to idols. The loss of this metaphysical understanding is what's led to evolutionism of all forms, including the so-called theistic evolution. When we understand that everything is a function, we can see the absurdity of the notion of evolution. An organ is a function. There is no intermediate point or intermediate function for an intestine to become a lung, or an eye to become an ear, any more than there's an intermediate function between a hammer and a saw. Everything is a function, and it appears spontaneously to do what it's supposed to do. This is why when people like Neil deGrasse Tyson say that the universe has no meaning or telos, what they're trying to say is that it has no function. And if we accept the notion of theistic evolution, then we compromise the integrity of function and wind up meeting the atheistic types on their own ground, where we can't effectively counter them. Because we've already surrendered a crucial point, what might be called the words that God spoke to bring the universe into existence. There are some very small exceptions to this, such as the move from wolf down to dog. And notice I said down and not up as the evolutionists do. But that's getting into the question of domestication, which is a very interesting question, but it's another spiritual phenomenon that really deserves its own video. Exclusivism of both varieties, which is the scientific exclusivism which believes that there's meaning in man-made things but not in natural things, and also the religious exclusivism, which thinks that there's meaning only in my religion but not in other religions, is both coming from the same mentality. It creates an artificial boundary and says, meaning exists here but not out there. Or within here is the full meaning, but out there is only partial, misinterpreted meaning, or else none at all. Like, only we have the full and clear view over here, but out there they're just groping around in the dark. What is the function of religion? It's telling you right in the name. Religare, to rebind, to reconnect man with his source, to reconcile the one and the many. It's the identical meaning of the word yoga. And of course, yoga does not just mean the physical poses like we think here in the West. It includes many different practices, a few of which are physical, but many more of which are mental and spiritual. A religion, like everything else, is a function. Arguments over religion are just arguments over function. The question then is not which function is the only true function, because there can't be only one true function. It depends on where you're starting from and what your particular circumstances are. If you need to get to a certain place, you may need a boat, you may need a car, or you may even need a horse or a camel. It just depends. This is why one of the most common terms used for religion in the East is a vehicle. In Christianity, churches are often called the Ark of Salvation. They understand we're talking about a vehicle. They just believe that theirs is the only vehicle. Even the act of making distinctions in the first place, of identifying or naming things, as we're told Adam was given the power to do in the book of Genesis and the Quran, has a purpose. And that purpose is not just to continue hair-splitting and making more and more distinctions, moving further and further downwards and getting lost in a sea of multiplicity as modern science has now devolved into. The purpose of making distinctions is to reconcile them, to understand how they're just different aspects of the same thing and use them to move upwards, to transcend them. Making distinctions as tools to leverage you up out of all distinctions. An alchemist once said, the first substance cannot be obtained except by destroying the specific properties of a thing. This theme is ubiquitous in every legitimate spiritual tradition. Indeed, it could be said that this is man's function or vocation. To reconcile the subjective and the objective, or the one and the many. So, if every positive name and identification is really just a function, a motion, then what is that one thing that is not in flux? That is not doing anything, but just is? Because there has to be something stable in the midst of all the change in motion, the so-called unmoved mover. What is that one thing that itself is not a function, but is served by all the functions? That thing within which all the motion is occurring, and yet which is paradoxically unaffected by it. The answer is that every function, including a religion, does, but only God is. And so the only real question in all this, when we examine religion, is one of orthodoxy, or truth. And by orthodoxy, I mean lowercase o orthodoxy. Does the vehicle lead one to the absolute or not? Does it provide a clear view of the absolute or not? Everything else is just a question of relative function as applied to relative people and relative individuals in relative circumstances, and everything relative must give way to the absolute. And of course, the response to that will be, "Oh, you're a relativist." Well, yeah, I am a relativist with respect to relative things, because only the absolute is absolute. And everything outside of the absolute is relative. And everything relative must give way to the absolute. Everything that does must give way to what is. Just as John the Baptist told us when he said, "He must increase, but I must decrease." And as Christ told us when he said, "Why do you call me good? There are none good but God alone." If we raise our religion, which is still just a function, to the level of what's above all function, all action, movement, change, duration, and so on, then we risk losing sight of what's real. So let's continue to cherish our religion, while at the same time never losing sight of the only thing that's truly real, which is the absolute, God.